I'm Jonathan, everyone, and I'm here to talk to you about the work that I do. So, somewhere around sophomore year, during winter break, I went home to my father, and there was something I needed to tell him, something I discovered while I was at college that was going to change my life. And I was very nervous about talking to my dad about this because growing up, he's a lawyer, and he always made a point of telling me how stupid he thought cartoons and comic books were. And the thing I had to tell him was that I wanted to spend the rest of my life being a cartoonist or making comic books. So this was a little point of anxiety for me, and I thought that the best way to try to change his mind was to come up with a little show and tell. My strategy was that I was going to cook him dinner, and then once he was full and unwary, I would spring upon him a stack of graphic novels that I thought best indicated the best work that's come out over the past few decades. Some of the really great work that defines what this genre is. Actually, before I get ahead of myself, right. Unbeknownst to my father, I'd already been working on them for a few years. So my first project was a translation of Beowulf that I did in college. Actually, my first project was a bunch of Ninja Turtle comics that never have seen the light of day. My second project, as was introduced, was Trinity, a history of the first atomic bomb, followed by Battle Lines, which came out last year about the Civil War. But my goal in talking to my dad was to let him know that there's been some serious, important, good work that has been done in comic book format. Some of the best examples are Alison Bechdel, and I don't know if that's on the front table. She wrote a book called Fun Home. Chris Ware has produced a book called Jimmy Corrigan. Mouse, of course, by Art Spiegelman, which was one of the greats and won a Pulitzer back in the 80s. And Will Eisner's Contract with God. Will Eisner is the guy who came up with the sort of awkward term graphic novel used to describe book-length comics or comics that have aspirations to something more than just superheroes or funny jokes. And part of my goal in talking to my father was not just to say that there's some really good work that's coming out in this form, but that it's been around for a long time, longer than any of us probably thinks. So I also showed him some stuff. This is some work by Lynn Ward, who was an author and artist in the 1930s, who produced these novels without words, these beautiful woodcut books that look sort of like silent films from the time. And then this guy, Winsor McCay, who was a syndicated newspaper cartoonist at the turn of the century, who did just the most mind-bendingly surreal cartoons that were coming every week in national newspapers in the Sunday Funnies. But the more that I looked at it, the more I realized that this tradition stretches back way further than the 20th century. And so part of my goal, I convinced my father, it helped convince him that once I got a book deal, he saw that someone was going to pay me for this crazy idea. But I went back to school and I spent a lot of my time trying to figure out how I could learn more about the history of this art form. And what I want to do with you guys today is, in part, kind of recreate that conversation I had with my dad on a much bigger screen and talk about both the history of this format and some of the strengths that graphic media has for communicating information. And I think that you'll see that a lot of these strengths are the sorts of things that can translate over into other mediums, like film or interactive design, web technology, and whatnot. So, what follows is a very brief, very truncated history of graphic novels, as we would say tonight, in alt text. So I was tempted, when coming up with this history, to go as far back as possible to the dawn of human civilization and recorded history. This is an image from the cave paintings of Lascaux in France. It's about 17,000 years old. And you can see here a man is getting gored by a buffalo. These paintings are amazing. They cover the entire walls of the cave, and a lot of them are done in sequence. You can see animals actually moving in sort of like stop-motion drawings. And there's humans chasing them, humans being gored by them, humans eating them. It's tempting to look at this as like a very early precursor of graphic novels and comics, although the thing is there was no actual written language for this to be an alternative to, so it doesn't really count as an alt text at this point. It's still, maybe the only alternative was oral communication, storytellers by the campfire. But if we jump ahead a little bit, this is Egypt. This is 3,000 years ago. This is the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's a combination of hieroglyphs and illustrations of the sorts of gods and curses and challenges you're going to encounter on your way to the afterlife. This is starting to look more like the things that we understand as comics. You've got really strong graphic lines, really bold images, bold colors, but still hieroglyphs are actually their own language. They can be read like a text. So again, this is just equivalent to writing. This is not quite the synthesis of words and pictures that I'm really looking for. In Greece, another few thousand years later in the Attic period, in the early period of Greece, they started making these vases. This is called a black figure vase. It's like a very specific kind of vase that they made. And you can see there's inscriptions around these figures. I can't read Greek, but apparently what it says is that this is Achilles, and that's Ajax, and they're playing board games. And then it also lists the person who is responsible for making the vase, and it also lists whose vase it was, and the horrible thing that's going to happen to whoever steals or breaks the vase. So all of this stuff is starting to be embedded with the images themselves. We're starting to get this idea of words and pictures working together to create a message that is more than just the sum of its parts. Unfortunately, though, these things are really rare, and there's not many out there that have these kinds of inscriptions. So if we really want to go and look at the roots of what I'm going to call graphic narrative, the idea of using words and pictures to tell a story, I think the most important place to look, at least in the Western world, is church art. Things that were developed in the Middle Ages, either paid for or in service of the Catholic Church. Now, when you think about church art, I immediately go to frescoes, paintings, things like the Sistine ceiling, stained glass windows, sculptures. But for our purposes, I think illuminated manuscripts are really the starting point of this tradition. In the Middle Ages, scribes, the only way that they could preserve information was to take one book and copy it, put it into another book. And as difficult and laborious as this was, pretty soon scribes started to experiment a little bit. It wasn't just about communicating exactly what was written, but adding embellishments, either for rich patrons who demanded some kind of book that showed how rich they were, or just because they were bored and they wanted to add more illustrations. So this is an example of one of these early illuminated books. This is an Annunciation. So you see the Virgin Mary, an angel is coming down to tell her that she is pregnant with the Son of God. And the angel is bearing a scroll. It's a lot like a word balloon. You have some of the rudiments of a frame. You have figures that are recognizable. This is clearly the sort of thing that someone who knows the story can look at this image and start to reconstruct something of what is happening. The apex of this tradition happened in Ireland around 800 AD. This is the Book of Kells. And this is an amazing book. It's huge. It's this big. And it should give you a sense of how detailed it is. This is the opening pages of one of the Gospels, called Cairo pages, X and R. It's the first two words of Christ in the Greek alphabet. But the cool thing about this stuff is that it's so intricate. There was a purpose to it. It wasn't just about making something that, the rich benefactor of this book could feel proud about. It was actually creating a reading experience for the person who was looking at the book. The goal of this was to create a reason for the person who was reading this gospel to be in a mindset that would prepare them to receive the word of God. You sit in a very quiet, inward-looking, private moment. Your mind is focused on the detailed, intricate handiwork. And it puts you in a meditative state. And I think this is really important for our Western tradition of what it means to be a scholar, what it means to read, is to remember that there is a purpose to the medium that we are using. And part of that purpose is to create the space for the person to understand what's happening. You need to be in a quiet, private, reflective state to receive the information. That said, these books that were made for the rich, for the literate, were not reaching the majority of Christians in Europe. The majority of Christians in Europe couldn't read, and they were not rich. So a tradition emerged, and this is of the so-called Paupers Bible. This is an example. This is from a little later. This is from the 16th century. But you can see here, this is sort of rudimentary, cartoonish images of scenes from the Bible. And it was meant to be distributed. It could be printed relatively cheaply. It was meant to be distributed to a population that couldn't read. but could still, maybe they'd heard the stories in church, they could still look at these images and glean some knowledge from them. And this is really what it's like, this is the thing that I would point to as the beginning of the graphic narrative tradition. You have the elements here, you have the really bold lines, you have the sort of simple cartoonish figures, and maybe more importantly, you have the cheap and quick element of it. But I think it's really important for someone who comes from the world of comics, it's important to make things quickly, easily, cheaply, and with an element of disposability to them. It's hard to get too precious about it, and I think that tradition really emerged from this. These were meant to be looked at and abandoned, but the idea was the message, not the object itself. So we looked at the church tradition. At the same time, there was a secular tradition going on. This is called the Bayeux Tapestry. It's also in France, and it is a 100-foot-long banner of sorts. It's been embroidered, and it celebrates the Battle of Hastings, when the French Normans crossed the Channel and defeated the English king to take over what is now England. The Bayeux Tapestry is pretty amazing because it does something that's never really been done before. It shows people doing something in a sequence, and it tells the entire story. So when you look at that thing, you can see, here are the Normans preparing to cross the Channel. So what do they need to do? They need to build ships. Before that, they need lumber. Before they have lumber, they need to cut the trees down. So the entire sequence of their preparations for war is represented on this page. And then, of course, they get to England, and they slay the Saxons. But here's another element of the Bayeux Tapestry that's important. You can see there's writing up there. There's captions throughout the thing. The most popular word is up there in the left-hand corner, hic, Latin for here. You get the sense that this tapestry has this word over and over again. And it's as if these are little flags that someone who's explaining the tapestry can point, okay, here's where this happens. Here is where Harold, the king, is killed. It's little markers. And this is the first time that the text is actually secondary. Images are first, and then there's captions if you need extra help. It's the complete reversal of what we're used to as the illustration that illustrates the text. And then my favorite part about the Bayeux Tapestry is that it preserves historical details in visual form. See all these people pointing up? They're pointing at a comet. And of course in the Middle Ages, comets were a terrible omen, but we know that that's a real comet. That's actually Halley's Comet. And it was recorded in this tapestry around 1200 AD. And it was only, in the past couple hundred years that historians could reconstruct that was an actual celestial event that happened. So here you have a graphic narrative that is not just telling about people, but it's marking actual historic events that have happened in the world that we can refer to. Okay, so let's jump ahead a little bit. This is the Renaissance, and this is some of my favorite stuff. This is a book called De Re Metallica by a guy, Agricola, a German, and it was a mining textbook that was popular for hundreds of years. It was one of the best mining textbooks in Renaissance Europe. The cool thing about it is, if you notice, the same figure appears many times doing separate things. And you can track this guy, and they're using a dowsing rod to find the ore. So it gives you an idea of how effective a mining technical book this was. But this guy in the corner, he's got his stick. He's going, well, actually in the middle is where he gets the stick off the tree. It's a very special stick. And then he goes around, and he finds the vein, and then he mines it, and he finds the ore. But what's remarkable is that this is the first time that on a single page we've got a character that we can recognize, an action that we can follow, and it's all happening in a sequence that creates a story. So none of this, we don't have to speak Latin or read Latin to understand what's going on here. This can reach across 700 years, and still it's something that makes sense to us. I don't know if it's going to lead us to any goal, but it's something that we can understand. So in the subsequent years, I'm going to jump ahead now, this is the 19th century, but printing technology improved, things got more detailed, you could represent with more accuracy information. But what really changed in the 19th century was the addition of comics for magazines, illustrations for magazines and newspapers. Ephemera that was printed sometimes daily, producing news that you could consume and dispose of. And the best way to communicate information often in a quick way was through images. This is a great map showing, so in 1877, the Ottoman Empire in Turkey was thought to be collapsing. So you can see the image here is a sick Turk. He's old. And the worry was that if Turkey collapses and the Middle East goes, then what's going to happen to the balance of power in Europe? So this newspaper editorialist was like, oh, well, obviously Russia, the octopus, is going to swoop in and take over. I mean, this is the same problem we're dealing with now, right? This was a very powerful editorial illustration about what the rest of Europe is doing to ignore the problem, and that clearly Russia is going to take over and mess everything up. The same year, actually within a month, this comes out. Same map, same idea, but now Russia is an avenging angel. And the Tsar is clearly the heroic. He's not only saving Europe, he's slaying the Turks. He's doing it all for everyone. And the rest of Europe, there's a child empress, there's a fat and lazy Austrian emperor. So you have, not only do you have this, the use of illustrations as an argument, as a polemic. This is very easily and succinctly communicates, this is basically an editorial cartoon. But you have the idea that illustrations are telling you information about what's happening right now, what's going to happen tomorrow. This is not just for history textbooks anymore. This is not just to memorialize a great battle or to tell you about the stories of the Bible. This is news. And so, of course, then we actually have editorial cartoons. And this is from the Civil War era. This is Thomas Nast. He was one of the great illustrators of that period. The magazines at the time, the newspapers, they didn't have the technology to reproduce photographs, even though photographs were the most accessible way to video or to record the action of the war. So what they would do is they would send sketch artists out to the front lines, and the sketch artists would draw the battles, and they would send those sketches home, and the engravers would turn them into these sorts of cartoons. So it was not just a daily sort of thing, it was of the minute. This is how the world learned about war, was from cartoonists. I love this one because, so this is coming out in 1864. This is the year that Lincoln is up for re-election. The war is going to be over in a year, but people don't really know that. Everyone's exhausted, everyone's terrified. And this is coming back from the Democratic convention, where they announced their platform. The Democrats were the party of secession, and they wanted to have 2 separate states. And Thomas Nast was a staunch Republican, a Lincolnite who wanted to preserve the Union. So what he did was pretty remarkable. He printed the full text of the Democratic platform in the writing here, but then he drew illustrations that completely subverted the whole thing. So, I don't know if you can see it, but up here, there's a picture. Beneath it says, the Constitution itself has been disregarded. This is the claim that the Democrats make. Nast, as a counter-argument, draws a picture of Lincoln freeing the slaves. So yeah, the Constitution was disregarded because the Constitution didn't legitimize anybody who was black. What he's done is created this fundamental irony in comics, where you can say one thing and show another. And that is just the bread and butter of all political cartoons. And from here on out, you can see all the elements are here. This is essentially comics. This is 115 years old. Okay, part 2. Comics, what are they good for? It's not just enough to see that these things have been around for a long time. This mode of storytelling has been around for a long time. It has some specific strengths, actually, that I think it's important to notice, because I found, at least, I can translate those into other areas, other ways of creating and distributing information, or I specifically use them when I make my own comics. So the first of these that I want to talk about is scale. In my book Trinity, about the atomic bomb, one of the really big challenges was that I was tasked with having to figure out how to represent the death of 200,000 people in an instant. This is what the bomb did when it landed on Hiroshima. How do you even show that? I can't draw 200,000 people. That'd be impossible. The trick that I found is matching the minuscule with the macro. Is mix the small and the big. And that works well if we're talking about the atomic bomb, because this massive destruction comes from the splitting of invisible atoms. But so in this page, you can see the little boy, the bomb that fell on Hiroshima, is detonating. And you see both the triggering mechanism and the splitting of the atoms, and then the destruction that it wreaks on the entire city. This would be very hard to represent in language. It's totally possible, but the thing about language is that it's linear. So if you were trying to describe this, you would have to start with the atoms and end up with the destroyed city, which works, but once you get to the destroyed city, you've forgotten about the atoms. Here, you show it all at once. And that's an important thing to remember, is that the shifts in scale can happen at the same time. And it creates this really, I think, important cognitive dissonance, so that you see the big and the small at the same time, you don't know which you're supposed to reconcile. The same can be said for the personal experience. This was also a really hard thing to try to represent. It's inconceivable. How do you even show it? But one of the attempts that I made was to try to just show, if you can't show the individual pathos, you can at least hold it up to the overall experience. Try to show that shift in scale, the vastness of the spectrum between the personal experience and the collective experience. And hopefully that is a measure of the trauma. Okay, the second tool, and one of my favorites, is irony. I used this a lot when I was writing about the Civil War, in part because war itself lends itself to discussions of absurdity and irony. And comics are particularly good at this sort of thing. This is a panel that I made about slavery. Because of page constraints, I had like 3 pages to talk about slavery, which is kind of a bind, because if you do it in 3 pages, it seems like it's a disservice to this horrible thing. But you can't not do it, so you have to talk about it. How do you talk about something terrible, give justice to it, but also do it kind of briefly so that you can tell the story of a 6-year war? This was one of the challenges I faced. I don't know if I met it, but one of the solutions I had was this panel on the lower left. I'm particularly proud of it. Nobody ever seems to notice it, which is why I'm telling you guys about it. But look at this line. It was a lucrative time to be a southern plantation owner. The trick is to say one thing and show another, to create some sort of tension between the words that are coming at you and the image that you see. So of course it was a lucrative time to be a plantation owner, because they've earned all of their profit in the blood of African slaves. This kind of irony is fundamental, whether anyone realizes it when they're doing it, fundamental to the idea of graphics, narrative, visual storytelling. And that's the sort of thing that you can translate to film, you can translate to web design. Anytime there's an image and some sort of delivery of information, it's really important to remember that they don't always have to say the same thing. And in fact, it's better when you hear one thing and you see another, because it wakes you up, it keys you in, the idea that something's going on here. Here's another image from that same chapter. This was about the attempts to try to explain that our whole system was built on this edifice of laws and bills and very noble ideas, but at the base of it was an irreconcilable problem. That our Constitution both codifies liberty and it codifies slavery. And at some point, you're going to have to reconcile those two. Again, images are a really nice place for this sort of thing, because you can show the metaphor. I don't ever explain this metaphor. I don't ever say it outright that this is a metaphor, but you can see it right here. You can represent it visually. It saves a lot of time for your writing, but it also creates a reason to, it creates a metaphor that you can then build off of and play with in a way that you were never beholden to by the language itself. It's working sort of independently of the language itself. And then finally, my favorite, this is the gutter. This is the most important aspect of the comics. This is the spot between the images, the blank space on the page, the silence. So typically, when you're creating a comic narrative, you are looking at panels. So this soldier who's walking home through the woods, you see these 3 images, and in the space between is where you, as the reader, you're the one who's creating the action. You're the one in your mind, without even realizing it, you're saying, oh, well, he's coming closer to me, so he's moving through the woods. I've just shown you 3 pictures of a person in the woods. You guys are the ones who are creating the action. In a situation like this, it's very straightforward. There's no difficulty here. This is a clear progression. But there's a great opportunity here to mess with people. And I found that when you mess with people is where interesting things happen. Here's another example. This is about a woman in Richmond who decides that she's going to protest the wartime conditions and the rationing. So she joins in a mob. Here's 3 images that are somehow connected in our minds. But you guys are the ones who are doing the through line, the story. And there's a little bit of tension here because we don't know if she's, assuming it's the same person who's picking the brick up. And has she thrown the brick already? Is she joining in the crowd? The idea is that you can, just just by putting images together, create several possible narratives, or create one narrative that's kind of messy and has some flux to it. Again, it all comes down to this idea of tension. That if you're creating a tension, often it makes the reader work a little harder, and it creates this feeling that there's participation between the storyteller and the person who's receiving the information. And then the third option is this, which is just outright chaos. No panels, no gutters, just complete free-for-all. You guys are on your own, it's just chaos. Okay, and that, I hope that I can show you some, not just the history of comics, which is sort of an esoteric thing, it's something I'm very passionate about, but when you look at this history, you can see that it's first of all, it's not something new. It's not something rare, and it's not something hyper-specialized to this genre of graphic novels. This is part of the human condition, figuring out how to use images, and sometimes words, sometimes other ways of communicating, using them in Congress to create new forms of communication, which is sort of what we're here today to talk about. So, I'm curious to hear some of your questions. Thank you for having me.
Yay. I'm emceeing now. So, I'm going to start with questions from you, otherwise I've got some questions boiling in my head too, but...
How do you choose your topics?
How do I choose my topics?
Oh, he did that on purpose.
You did that on purpose, probably.
I haven't planned.
Well, these topics seem to just be mass death, which is unfortunate, but I think part of it is stories, at least for the atomic bomb, stories that a younger generation has no experience with, but still represent really important, issues. Nuclear security. This is a thing that people who didn't grow up during the Cold War have no real conception of. But the goal is to try to find a new way of communicating this history to a new audience.
How did you turn your talent in drawing cartoons? Like, how did you get into your career field?
Sure.
How do you make money at that?
I think it's a combination of total luck, as being at the right place at the right time, drawing comics since forever. So I had a portfolio when that moment of luck happened. And I don't know what the third part was. Yeah, let's say luck and preparation. I know everybody says that, but for me it was, I was making comics on my own. A buddy of mine from high school, we started a little company together where we would make, small limited edition zines, books, we could print at Kinko's, and then we would take them to comics conventions. So and they were always sort of about historical themes. So we built up a little, I think we made 10 books together. Those were just small little things. And then at the right time, I kept trying, sending letters of submissions to editors, and one of them bit. And once I got his attention, I never let go.
So you've chosen to go with graphic novels instead of syndicated comics. Did you think about syndicated comics? I mean, there seems to be some pressures connected with each.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think I really have the knack for syndicated comics. Those guys have to be able to produce so much so quickly, and they also have to be able to tell a story in 3 panels, which that was something that I could never really do. Part of the reason I got into comics is because I didn't want to tell a story in 1 panel. I wanted to be able to have 200 pages to do it. So I think that was sort of the trade-off that I made, is I didn't feel like I was punchy enough to be able to do that every day of the year. But I bet that's a good gig if you can get it. Anyone else?
You guys can hear us okay, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Then we don't have to be doing that. So your very first panel said something to the effect of, why are they good for teaching history?
Mm-hmm.
But you never really talked about why they're specifically good for teaching history.
Yeah, that's a good point. I did put that subtitle on at the last minute. But I do think they're good at teaching history, partly for that irony thing. For the idea that you can... So for the Civil War book, I worked with a historian who was He was a great guy to work with, but he was very adamant that I don't make things up, that all the stuff that's in there is real, which is fine, but it's kind of a constraint. One of the cool things about this constraint, though, is that if you have the words say things that are true, the images are a lot less, you have a lot more freedom. And with history, you can include historical sources in a way that you don't have to exactly articulate them. So I did a whole chapter about this photographer, Alexander Gardner, in the Civil War, who posed the bodies that he took pictures of. There was a very famous body of a Confederate soldier that was shot. That he was not shot there, he was not a sharpshooter. He actually dragged the body to the spot, gave him a rifle, posed his head a little bit, took the picture, and that was one of the most famous images of the Civil War. So I portrayed that scene, the whole thing, without ever saying that this is what's happening. Because there's some question about exactly what did happen. They know that it was posed, they know that there's the same image of this body in many different places, but historians aren't sure exactly what happened. And so there's this kind of disconnect where you can show one thing and say another thing. I know I keep coming back to it, but I think that's one of the most useful tools for telling history. You can embed the historical information visually, and you can do it verbally, and those two don't always have to line up.
Well, and since history often doesn't line up depending who's telling it.
Totally, yeah.
Have you ever played with telling the same story from different perspectives?
Yeah, and actually one of the chapters of the Civil War book, Battle Lines, is about the riots that happened in New York. The draft riots, and it follows three narratives. It follows the narrative of a young African-American orphan, a young Irish immigrant, and also a young, blue-blooded Anglo-American. And it is sort of all three stories about what happened that day are happening at the same time. And each story feels like they're telling their version of what happened. The Irish story is about the strength of Irish immigrants. The African-American story is about what happened to them, and the blue-blood is about their power as well. And so, yeah, it's that exact thing. Is that you can show these different narratives that I think would be a lot more cumbersome if you tried to express them verbally. You can have them all out on the page, and then let the reader figure out, okay, which is the history, it forces them to think historiographically, which is the one that is most accurate.
Just looking occasionally to see if anybody else does. Earlier when we were talking, you mentioned your biggest hope with readers of comics. Can you articulate for them? Because I thought it was pretty cool.
Well, one of the frustrations with this is that, it took me like 4 years to make each of these books. And it takes like 45 minutes to read it, which is really disappointing when someone comes up and it's like, oh yeah, this was so quick, it took me half an hour. But one of the flip side of that is that these are really easy to reread. And it's my hope that someone who goes through one of these books, or actually any graphic book, you pick up enough visual cues that there's a lot going on here that you're not necessarily going to catch the first time around. And if it only takes you an hour to read it, and this is another reason why I think it's good for students, that you can assign it and it takes a night or two. It's not like assigning a 200-page book out of prose. And the hope is, that someone's going to pick it up 3 or 4 times and each time discover something new.
So you grew up in Montana?
Mm-hmm.
Where?
I grew up in Kells, Big Fork.
Okay, so when did you realize that you could draw? In high school, grade school?
Probably in grade school. That was when I got into it.
And then
I think I'm like everybody can draw. It's just a matter of the point at which you decide that you're not going to. I feel like every kid can draw at some point. I just kept doing it.
somewhere in there you gotta learn perspective.
Somewhere you gotta learn perspective, yeah.
Which I never did. So everything I draw looks like a mower by a steamroller.
Oh yeah, sometimes people pay a lot of money for that.
So when you went to Stanford, had you decided to major in graphic design? Or?
No, I didn't. I studied history. I didn't want to go to art school. I wanted to study history, and I was sort of I wanted to avoid spending a life as a cartoonist, but it caught up with me, and I was pretty excited.
But you had that idea. I mean, it was sort of.
It really what happened when I read Beowulf, this old English poem, about warriors slaying dragons, and I thought this would be a really cool graphic novel. Because it's a story that was told orally. It was only, it wasn't really put down in text. It was mainly a story that was told around a campfire. And I thought, well, what if we try to, and this actually gets the idea of alt text. Like, what if you take stories, like the old stories that were all oral, especially from cultures that didn't have a written tradition. What if the best way of recording those is not someone coming in and writing them down in verse, but drawing them, like coming up with a new way of showing them? So that's really what got me started. I did Beowulf in comic book form. I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. I think I'll keep doing this.
But then you went to Columbia for writing?
Yeah.
Did that pay off, do you think?
That's hard to say. Still working on it. It paid off because I met a lot of people, and I was in New York, so I met, that's where all the publishers are. So I got a lot of attention from people there. But hard to say if it's worth it.
Well, no, I just meant,
I think the writing.
Focus on, the word, or at least how, the masters have used the word, which ought to help you in the dialogue or the
For sure.
whatever you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. I think the thing that was most important for this kind of stuff was really paying attention to the idea of trying to say something in as few words as possible. Because that's the challenge of comics, you don't have much room. So if you can say something in a sentence, or even less, my dream is to have a comic that has no words in it that people understand, but nobody wants to pay for that.
So most of your work is historical comics, and a lot of the examples you gave earlier were historical, like House or something like that. I'm wondering what you think about graphic novels as a way of conveying other kinds of information, like for science or for criminal justice or for even mathematics or something like that. Do you think that has potential as a teaching?
I think it's amazing. Yeah, I think it's history is. I do history because it's what I feel comfortable doing. If I understood math, that's the kind of comic I would make, because I feel like that's where the real use for something like this. And actually, Jim asked me how I got my topics. The Civil War just sort of fell in my lap, but something like the atomic bomb in this book that I'm working on now about the Apollo missions. I feel like scientific and technical stories are really good when you can show what's going on without having to explain it. So like the splitting of a uranium atom makes a lot more sense when you can draw a schematic representation of it instead of having to describe it in words. So I think actually there's even more potential for technical uses of this. I found that my book gets picked up a lot, not just in history classes and English classes, but also in basic physics classes and chemistry classes, engineering, places where people want to be able to explain complicated information in a way that's accessible to someone who's not a specialist.
Do you use computers a lot for art? Do you freehand stuff and then scan it in and color it in? Or?
That's a good question, because every time I do it sort of differently, and I reinvent the wheel each time. The Civil War book looks like it was done by hand, but it was all done on a computer, which was really stupid, because it was twice as much work. I thought it was going to save me a lot of work. The next book I'm doing, I'm going to try to do it all by hand, because I'm convinced that in the end is actually easier. But at the end of the day, it's impossible to do. It's possible, but I definitely lean on computers for a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of stuff that's going on behind the scenes, like setting the type, arranging the panels so that when a person looks at the page, they don't get confused about which one to go to next. There's a lot of little tweaks that have to happen. And if you were just using, whiteout and an eraser, it would get pretty messy. So it's nice to be able to, control scenes.
How do you do so you're saying, and then, you were saying before, I have 3 pages to talk about slavery. Does the publisher say, you get 200 pages, and then you sit down and you're like, okay, page 1 through 3, I'm going to do this.
Yeah, it's sort of like that. It's a little bit of my own doing, because when you pitch a book, they want to know how many pages they're going to have to pay for. So you give them in the ballpark. It has to be a multiple of 4 or 16. So you really, when you're proposing it, you haven't written the book. You're sort of like, 260 sounds like exactly right. And then unfortunately they hold you to that, so that when it comes time to actually make the book, you're like, I just pulled that number out of my head. I have no idea. So that's sort of what happened there. I was like, okay, I have 220 pages, and it's taken me 217 pages to talk about everything but slavery, so this is what I've got left, or something like that. So there's a lot of planning, and the iterations, that's why it takes so long to make graphic stuff. There's a lot of planning.
So if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's sort of like any novel where you have to have a pretty decent outline to figure out.
Yeah, I think so. I've heard novelists who talk about how they just sort of sit down and let the characters talk. where they just explore what happens. And I want to believe that that's possible. I think that's a lot harder when you have to then draw it. So you asked why I got a degree in writing. That's part of, I want to be able to do both. I want to be able to write, because sometimes it's nice to write something, send it off, and be done with it. Whereas with graphic stuff, you write it, then you sketch it, then you ink it, then you color it, then you letter it, then you do the final copy. You know, there's just this kind of constant iteration. But I don't know if it's as freewheeling as what prose novelists do.
I just meant you have to have some particular order figured out.
Oh yeah, especially for history, because you know, there's the chronological narrative, and there's the goal of trying to teach something to people.
One thing that I really like about your graphic novels in particular, but a lot of graphic media is the focus on the facial expression. Like I just noticed that really carries the story of all the characters that come in and they're kind of telling the emotion of the progression of the story through their facial expressions. And do you spend a lot of, like, what do you spend the most time on? Like,
I would say either faces or hands. I sort of put those in the same category.
So,
because I think you're totally right. It's very expressive. This is how you, and actually some of those examples of old images that I showed, a lot of the tricks of the classic like master artists was to do just that, was to use people's faces and their hands and their like body gestures to communicate whole things. So yeah, thanks. I'm glad you say that, because it's.
that was my intuition that there must be a lot of thought that goes into the facial face. So
And there's a lot of little tricks too that you don't see about like where someone's looking is a good way to get the reader to then go to the word balloon that's above that person's head. Or if someone's making a gesture that's like this, and the word balloon's right there, the eye naturally goes to it. So there's all these kind of like artificial, mechanical stuff that's going on behind the scene. It's really manipulative. This whole thing is deeply manipulative because you're trying to figure out how to take a total stranger and make them look at something. And it's sort of a crapshoot, but yeah, faces, gestures, composition, it's all part of the strategy.
Going back to when you said you've had instructors use your books in history class, but also in science and engineering and stuff. Do you have a sense of how they're integrating graphic novels into their class? Are they using them as like primary texts or as supplements for specific lessons?
I think they're using them as supplements. I doubt it's as primary texts. I mean, there's a book out there, I guess it's the cartoon Introduction to Philosophy. I think it's one of the ones you guys have up front, which is a cool one you guys should look at. It's the same publisher that publishes my stuff. And they've also done one on statistics and economics. And so for those fields, those are assigned as primary books because they're written by economists and statisticians, and they're legitimate. My work has all been vetted by physicists, but I am really sort of in the dark when I'm more interested in history. So I found that a lot of teachers are using my books to supplement other books that are assigned. And this is where the short reading time comes in real handy, because you can assign this book to someone, and it's not like giving them a 10-hour assignment.
Do you have a sense of how much your books are being used in high school versus in college classes?
I don't really know. I don't know the distinction. But I've talked to both students. Yeah.
So speaking about reading times, an hour seems like a long time for students.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if maybe the format of the graphic novel and like the aspirations of the graphic novel could be merged with the serial comic, where it's like a quick 15 minutes, but still has the complexity you're talking about.
Totally. And there's a lot of people who do that. I think if you look at webcomics online, there's a lot of stuff like that where it's very short bursts of information. And that's something I've thought about in my books. The first one is not broken up into chapters, so that's why I say it's an hour to read. It takes to go through the whole thing. But I think with the next one that I do, I'm going to do just that. Make it like 10-page bursts so that you can sit down and get a coherent idea at one sitting. But yeah, there's a ton of webcomics that are doing stuff like that. It's harder for publishers to serialize things.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of graphic novels that are chapter broken, and I've assigned those by chapter instead of the whole book.
Yeah, and a lot of them start out as being actual comics. The comics artists make them on a monthly schedule. They come out as, you know, soft cover comics you get at a comic book store, and then the publishers collect them into an actual book. So those lend themselves well to short reading. Anyone else?
Jason's hovering, I think that means our time is up.
No, actually, I can listen to you guys all night. Great job, thank you.